senior thesis on anthropomorphism in children's literature. It's called Talking, Walking, Teaching, and I was very happy to be able to advise you on this very exciting.
Okay, so my name is Victoria Kim, and my subject is Talking, Walking, Teaching, the role of anthropomorphism in children's literature. One of my favorite childhood memories involves story time, and particularly bedtime stories. These stories will feature tigers, birds, mice, and dangerous beasts demanding food. My imagination always ran around with the possibility of one day talking to these animals. Even as a child, encounters with these animals were never a source of anxiety because I knew they were just like me. They had eyes and a nose, they had sleeping patterns, and most importantly, they spoke the same language as I did. As I first started reading on my own, the humanization of animals continued side by side and progressed far beyond my bedtime stories. Almost every book I picked up as a child featured an animal protagonist who not only communicated with words, but also wore shirts. In fact, animals in children's books were acting and speaking exactly like human beings. But even beyond that, animals acted as if they were humans, with bestial characteristics that were only secondary and even frivolous in contrast to the more sophisticated human qualities. Anthropomorphism in children's literature poses a multitude of interesting questions on the relationship between animals and humans, and particularly humans who portray animals in writing. Personification as a literary technique allows authors to give inanimate plants, animals, and objects attributes that are uniquely human. Anthropomorphism undoubtedly complicates the distinction between human and animal by taking what is essentially human and sharing it with non-human entities. But if the animal and human characteristics engage in the same activities in the story, how do we distinguish between what is human versus what is non-human? Is there a difference between humans and animals if they appear to be the same on the pages of literature? In observing the role of anthropomorphism within a historical range of children's literature, I have studied The Hare and the Tortoise from Aesop's Fables circa 600 BCE, Charles Perrault's Little Red Riding Hood from 1697, Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland from 1865, and Jan Martel's Life of Pi from 2001. My decision in selecting these works lies in the author's use of animal characters, but also the historical range between Aesop's fable and Martel's contemporary novel. In separating these four works into individual sections, I hope to demonstrate how the roles of animal characters progress from a strict adherence to an animal-human divide that necessitates a deliberate use of anthropomorphism to a mutual convergence that facilitates understanding between humans and animals. Animal characters take on multiple and diverse roles within children's literature, so that the relationship between animals and humans is not separate and stagnant, but rather one that is in active conversation and even conflict with one another. First, in Aesop's work, animals become actors in front of a human audience, as well as allegorical stand-ins and disguises of humans for humans in Little Red Riding Hood. Thirdly, animals also take part in absurdity in Alice's Adventures, and lastly, even becomes extensions of our own human selves in the fantasy of Life of Pi. First, the Hare and the Tortoise, animals as actors. The structural organization of Aesop's work is of particular interest to me in exploring the depiction of animals. In the same way that Aesop inserts a divide between the story and the moral, the author constructs a parallel distinction between animals that are always characters in the fable and humans who are always outside readers. A distinction between the narrative and the one-sentence moral exists so that the two represent individual sections rather than an entirely cohesive story. Aesop starts with, a hare was one day making fun of a tortoise for being so slow, and concludes on an entirely separate line with, slow and steady wins the race. The clear-cut isolation of the story from the moral mirrors the separation between the function of anthropomorphic characters in the narrative and the role of human audience learning from the moral itself. Animals take on the part of performing actors, whereas child readers, on the opposing side of the spectacle, become a watching audience. This depiction of a divided animal-human relationship is significant in that the child reader can identify the hare and tortoise as representatives of moral folly or virtue, but cannot relate personally to the animal actors. The anthropomorphic portrayal of animals that talk, but do not think nor experience emotions themselves, bring to question the lasting effects of Aesop's animal performers on child readers' human events, experiences that cannot be separated neatly into narratives on one side and moral on the other, or animals to the left and humans to the right. Animals as actors allows Aesop's fables to teach a lesson that never fully comes to life. Secondly, the Little Red Riding Hood, animals in disguise. In contrast to the hare and tortoise's roles as actors, Perrault's development of the wolf is significantly more complex and multifaceted. The wolf's impersonation of humans, both of Little Red Riding Hood and later the grandmother anthropomorphism in Aesop's fable, to a mutual convergence that facilitates understanding between humans and animals, as in Martel's work. Although my project addresses the different roles of talking animals, anthropomorphism is still very much in question. The enthusiasm in which children's literature authors and young readers adopt anthropomorphism is immediately countered by our innate desire to distance ourselves from anything remotely animalistic or bestial. There is a consistent and conflicting desire for animals to resemble humans and teach practical lessons to children while at the same time remaining in the wild and separate from human beings. Rather than resolving issues of morality, anthropomorphism questions the very boundaries between what is human or animal, good or bad, and right or wrong. Unfortunately, there are no straightforward answers to whether anthropomorphism is straining or aiming our collective understanding. However, one thing remains clear. This tradition of depicting animals and narratives has not only enriched our literary creativity and imagination, but more importantly, encourages reflections of ourselves, not only in relation to other human individuals, but non-human entities that share the world we live in.
I'm sure you have questions about the role of animals in children's literature. Vicki is now an expert. she will analyze your favorite stories.
I have a question. What made you pick, besides, I know you're looking at this scope of it here at the street, what made you pick these 4 texts over other ones?
I wanted to pick 4 that had pretty distinct characteristics, and I was first drawn to Life of Pi because I had read that as a young adult, I guess. And then I thought it was interesting that it did depict animals, but he remains entirely tiger throughout the entire novel, and that kind of sparked my interest in animal figures and narratives. And then the other 3, Aesop was like a foundational piece in terms of teaching, moral teaching. And then the other 2 kind of fell in place with the historical range, but with the historical range. There are just differences that I was interested in.
Other questions?
I have a similar kind of question regarding Life of Pi, which in a sense, as a Booker Prize winner, was initially an adult novel, and you read it as a young adult.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm interested in what we define as children's literature. How you establish boundaries for yourself to that whole category, since the last novel, some people would argue, was an adult novel.
Well, when I was researching children's literature, it was such an expansive topic because not only in terms of theme and content, but more as in picture books are considered children's literature, as well as poetry and all these different forms. One thing I emphasized on was that the experience of childhood, or kind of like a coming of age, coming to realize for the first time how things operate in the world, were things that I looked for in the 4 books that I selected, and that was kind of the definition of children's literature that I bounced off of, because the topic in itself is so extensive.
Other questions?
One more. I think it's so interesting that you ended with Life of Pi and that sort of convergence of animal and human in a particular way. In your study of children's literature and your experience as a child reader of children's literature, do you see that theme emerging more in an era of animal rights, that there is a convergence of animal and human?
Yeah, I definitely do think so. I think it was animals more as tools, or animals as more as like 2-dimensional figures, and as we progressing into more, I would say Life of Pi was a very weird like fantasy, because at the end of the novel you're not entirely sure whether the thing was a dream or if it actually happened. And I think that's kind of our growing understanding of animals and how things are in relation to us as we interact with them, and more like animals is not just things that we can use and things we can just drop, but more things we have to talk about, things that we have to integrate into our own conversations.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why this is peculiar to childhood that we use anthropomorphism. And it was crossing my mind as you were talking, I wonder if children have more openness to a diversity because they haven't differentiated yet. And so something is either the same or something is different, and whether or not that isn't something to be encouraged so that they stay more open to diversity.
When I was doing research I did research specifically on that effect on children, and I was thinking because they're not able to distinguish between the two, anthropomorphism is not necessarily wrong, but it's a difficult topic for them. One thing that I picked up from a child psychologist researcher was that it's more like animals experiencing the same things, because when a child is very like egocentric and thinks that everything is relating to the self. So when they read the tortoise and the hare, it's not literally the animal, but it's more like the emotion of the hare losing the race that the child identifies with, and that, or the loss of the race or the victory of the tortoise. But it's not necessarily like the animal, as the tortoise is an animal that the child grips onto. I understood it more like the emotional experience, and then relating that experience to his or her own experiences later on.
So do you think that leaves them open to learning and benefiting from whatever else might be different from themselves, so it should be encouraged in that sense in children?
Should I think in anthropomorphism?
Do you think that that would be a good thing in that sense, that leaves children open to the idea of learning from what might be different from themselves?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Great question as well. Great answer. We have time for one more question, then we'll move to our final presentation. Okay, well, I feel like hopping like a bunny or moving like a cat.
vicki는 안 나오는 거야? vicki 안 나와? vicki는 다 듣고 나오나 본데?
별로 안 좋아?
응?
별로 안 좋아?